to be introducing our honoree this morning, Staff Sergeant Joshua Goldstein, of blessed memory, of the United States Army Air Corps. And I'm pleased for three reasons. First, as many of you know, I am a big fan of our synagogue's history. Learning about the Jewish community of Chester dating back into the 1800s has always fascinated me. The legacy of our congregation, its place in the story of Delaware County, and really in the lengthy and sometimes fraught history of the United States. We were there. We were there for all of it. So any opportunity to either remind or introduce members of our congregation to our own story is always a source of joy for me. Because history, as Susan talked about history in her opening remarks, history is one of the things that we Jews do best. The second reason comes from an ancient rabbinic adage that states that every human being is an entire world. Our memories, our connections, our experiences, our impact on those around us, all of it is so unique to each person, and it constitutes a rich and multifaceted world. I have the privilege of learning about each of these worlds, many of them, throughout my work as rabbi, but in particular when writing a eulogy about someone at the end of his or her life. You may know someone, and just a few details about their past and their values, their hopes and dreams, but rarely do we glimpse the full tapestry of their time on this earth. So I truly value opportunities to share some of those worlds with all of you, to further demonstrate that every person around you, every human being we encounter is an entire, fascinating, complex world unto itself. And my third reason is because Josh Goldstein's story is just really riveting. Josh was drafted into the military around 1942 or 43, after the U.S. was dragged into the Second World War with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Josh joined the Army Air Corps, which later became the Air Force. Initially, he was taught gunnery and bomb making so that he could then teach others coming through training. But Josh didn't like that very much, because he wanted to go and fight for his country. He wanted to have more of a direct impact in the war effort. So he went back to training, this time to become a shooter, and was assigned to be a tail gunner. Now, I'm not a military person myself, and I certainly don't know much about the airplanes that were flown in the Second World War, but David, his son, shared with me his father's stories of those flights. Josh mainly flew on B-17 planes with many different crews. As you can imagine from the name, the tail gunner sits at the very rear of the plane, shooting at other aircrafts behind or around the plane. Well, in those days, the tail gunner would sit on what was essentially a bicycle seat, sometimes for 20 hours at a time, wedged into a tight space at the back, only accessible when the landing gear of the airplane was down. So once you're in the air, you're stuck in that spot for the duration. Add to that that delightful picture that I painted for you, that it was also freezing cold, both because you're obviously zipping through the air at high speed, but also because whatever heat was generated in the cockpit and the rest of the plane never made it back to the tail gunner. Oh, and then you have the small matter of other people shooting at you in the air. So one of the reasons that Josh flew with many different crews was because tail gunners were in short supply, in part because of everything I just described to you, and in part because many of them simply didn't make it home. Josh was based in England, flying missions into Germany and Russia. Each fighter in the Air Corps would fly 25 missions before they were done, before they could return home, and on Josh Goldstein's 24th mission, his plane was shot down over enemy territory. It was in May of 1944 that Josh's plane took a direct hit. The crew tried to stay on board as long as they could, hoping that they could make it until they were over Switzerland, but they weren't able to make it. The plane was literally on fire, and they all had to parachute out as the plane was going down. Many of the crew, most of them survived, about 15 men in all, and they landed around a town called Quedlinburg in Germany. Josh's parachute got stuck in a tree, and he was left dangling from the tree when he was found by some of the local villagers. He remembered hanging there and being stuck with a pitchfork by one particularly hostile farmer. The townspeople detained the whole crew until the German army could arrive and march them off to a POW camp. One of the crew members had injured his leg in the fall, and Josh was the one who had to carry the other man for at least a couple of days. Back in the U.S., Josh was declared MIA, missing in action. He would spend an entire year as a prisoner of war until they were finally liberated in 1945. I honestly cannot imagine what life was like for Josh and his crew members. They didn't know about the concentration camps at that time, but were instead kept only with other POWs. David told me that his dad had many stories from that year, though not very many pleasant ones. David said his dad always ate his meals in the darkest corner of whatever tent they were in because he preferred not to have to look at the food and whatever might be moving around in it. One of the brighter memories was that Josh became the guy who could get you stuff. Being Jewish, Josh spoke Yiddish and was thus able to communicate with the guards. He would broker many of the deals between prisoners and guards, often involving the exchanging of cigarettes, though Josh himself never smoked. They didn't get a lot of news about the war effort while they were in the POW camp, so Josh didn't know about D-Day, or that the Allied troops had turned the tide and were pushing the Germans further and further east. Josh could sense that something was up because the guards were constantly moving them away from the front lines, either sending them east in boxcars on trains or taking them on forced marches. Finally, at long last, Josh and his fellow prisoners were liberated by the Russian army in June of 1945. He then made his way back to England and was sent on a ship back across the ocean to the United States. Josh, who at the time was very skinny, was greeted as a war hero and awarded several medals. He came back with many stories from his experiences, and even though he never wanted to be interviewed on camera or have his story written down, he did love to regale people with war stories to friends and to family. Looking back now, it's truly a shame that he never told that full version, start to finish, so that it could be saved for posterity. But his legacy, his entire world, lives on through his family, and now through this congregation, and through all of us. I am so grateful on this Memorial Day to be able to remember Josh Goldstein's story and to share it with all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, our 2022 Memorial Day honoree, Staff Sergeant Joshua Goldstein of the United States Army Air Corps.